Hello again. So, welcome to Volume 3, the third of the 3 volumes of the Lam Rim Chenmo. So before we start, let's set motivation again. So what do I mean by setting motivation is to think about trying to make use of this time, to listen closely and to consider how what's being said might help us in our lives, help to inform us in our lives. And the traditional idea is to, like we're starting a session at the gym, or we're starting a sport, or going out to play football in a team. The team manager sort of gathers us all around and says, right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to win. We're going to take the best. So the idea in ourselves, rather than having, I'm not the team manager, we are our own team manager, to try to say, okay, come on, let's make the most of this, right? So we get an opportunity just to think for a second about making the most of this opportunity to take advantage of these few minutes, at least once a week, and put it towards thinking about how we might improve ourselves. I'm not suggesting that I have a huge amount of wisdom or any more wisdom than you, but I'm hoping that maybe what I have to share has it can be inspiring or can trigger some thoughts, or to help possibly consider some new ways of seeing things. And that's all I'm really hoping for. But the purpose of this, from my point of view, and from the traditional Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist sense, is to think about putting ourselves, remembering our commitment to working to benefit all beings through becoming a Buddha. So it's from within a state of loving kindness and compassion we work in terms of our Dharma practice, that compassion reaches to all beings without exception. And this is why the Lama Tsong-kapa wrote this book, and it became a source book for many practitioners for the last 600 years or so. So it's doing well, 620 something. So book 3 carries on from 6 perfections, but it's a specialization. So really, the book 2 was an introduction to the Mahayana path, and covered bodhicitta and the development of bodhicitta, the acceptance or the generation of this mind of enlightenment for all beings, leading to the bodhisattva vow, and then the bodhisattva trainings, which are known as the 6 perfections. So what does it mean to be a bodhisattva? Being who, sattva means being, bodhi means enlightenment in this sense, and essentially a being whose aim is enlightenment, but specifically for the benefit of all sentient beings. And what makes us a bodhisattva isn't because we go to a Mahayana Buddhist school, or because we listen to Mahayana teachings, or because our friends belong to a Mahayana tradition, or because we have a Mahayana name, or any of these. None of these are reasons for being a bodhisattva. None of these qualify us as walking a Mahayana path. So it's impossible for us to walk a Mahayana path unless we have unless we are bodhisattvas, or aspiring to be bodhisattvas. So within that, the idea is to say that until we are aspiring or actually engaged as bodhisattvas, then we're not really practicing Mahayana tradition. We're not Mahayana practitioners. So what is it? What's that qualifying? What is it that qualifies us to consider ourselves to be Mahayana practitioners if it's not the sutras, if it's not the study, if it's not the type of meditation that we do? It's not our friends, it's not our teachers, it's not our Buddhist centers. So what is it? One thing, whether or not we have this promise, is bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is what gives us, qualifies us to be bodhisattvas, and when we're practicing, or aspiring to be bodhisattvas, and when we're practicing, when we're working on developing our bodhicitta, or we're working with bodhicitta, at those moments we are engaging in the Mahayana path. When we're not practicing with that motivation, then we're not. So the qualifying factor is just this one thing, whether or not our aspiration, our motivation is bodhicitta. If it's bodhicitta, then in terms of this responsibility towards all sentient beings, engaging in this idea of becoming a Buddha for that purpose, then that makes it Mahayana. if our view is qualified, if our understanding of the nature of reality is in accordance with the Four Noble Truths, and we recognize the suffering, impermanent, selfless, and empty nature of phenomena around us, then we are actually engaging most completely in the Mahayana path. So without that, we're approximating it, we're getting close. And as we develop these two bodhicittas, the one based on loving kindness and altruistic motivation towards all beings without exception, and while we have that and we have this correct view, then we're engaged fully in the Mahayana path, even if we have yet to develop our abilities very much. So while we're doing that, that's what makes us Mahayana. And this text, again, and I've said this before, but this text is based upon this idea that we are wanting to, or we see value in engaging in the Mahayana path. So Je Rinpoche now moves on to volume 2, just the last two perfections, and we'll be looking for about 8 sessions at the development of serenity or concentration, the fifth perfection, and then the remaining 200 pages, so 20-something sessions, will be on emptiness, on insight specifically to do with understanding emptiness and selflessness. So he's now going to explain why and how these two work together. So just like these two aspects of bodhicitta, the ultimate bodhicitta and relative bodhicitta, the compassion-based, the altruism-based bodhicitta, and the wisdom-based bodhicitta, which are like the two wings of a bodhisattva, what we're going to now look at is how insight or emptiness, so the view, is, or the ultimate bodhicitta, requires samatha, or a powerful concentration. So this concentration is required for us to develop our insight, and our insight helps our concentration, but in the end we're looking at a dependent relationship, and that's what Rinpoche is going to be talking about this week. So first of all, Rinpoche is going to be really saying, he's talking about serenity. So this idea is, we'll talk about why these words serenity and concentration, samatha, or shine as well, calm abiding, pliancy, these words are sort of interchangeable in this sense. We're looking at a particular type of meditation. There are lots and lots of different types of meditation. There's analytical meditation where we consider things and work things out. And then there's also this very strong form of concentration meditation where we're learning to calm our minds, put our minds into a state of perfect clarity, sort of almost the idea of there's a Zen teacher who used to say it's like a muddy water, and then if you just wait, the mud sinks out and the water becomes fresh. So likewise, if we just keep it calm, we allow it to get more and more gentle, the confusion and the noise dissipates, and we end up with this very, very bright clarity in our mind, and a strong flexibility in the ability for us to naturally focus or to put our full awareness on anything we like. So this serenity is the word that's being used in this translation here. There are lots of other words we can use. So he says that basically you're going to divide this into a few sections, and what he wants to do is to say that these two include all the states of meditation, the nature of these two, and how to be certain how they work together. He says, first of all, all of the, regardless of the Dharma tradition, regardless of whether or not we're following the Theravadin or the Pratyeka, the Sravaka, or the Mahayana, or as well as the Vajrayana, all the other different traditions that there are within Buddhism, all of the qualities that arise in the practitioners depend entirely upon serenity and insight. So one of the marks of Buddhism, in terms of the entire Buddhist path, was mentioned last year, is the three higher trainings of sila, is ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So the sila, the practices of ethical ability and the importance of sustaining our ethics are required in order to help us calm our mind. All right. So then it's in this calmness, once we've developed some ethical discipline, we're then able to develop this calmness of mind. This is why also, very, very importantly, when we're working on ethics and ethical discipline, to remember that mental discipline is very, very important. Speech discipline, body discipline, and mental discipline, very important. If we have malice, or we are impatient, or we want to cause trouble, or we have a strong attachment, all of these things will diminish our ability to sustain or develop a calm mind. So Rinpoche here quotes from the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning. He says, "Maitreya, you should know that all mundane and supramundane virtuous qualities, whether of the Sravakas, the Bodhisattvas, or the Tathagatas themselves, are the result of meditative serenity and insight." So then in this sense also is saying that there's a qualm, if you like, saying, well, how can we say that we just all the qualities are from these two alone when we have all these other things which are also good qualities? And Rinpoche says, well, in a sense, these good qualities are two of the fruits as well as the causes of these other engagements. So he says, it's not as if all the good qualities of the Mahayana and so on result from them. However, the concentrations which we depend upon in order to be able to pierce the most subtle of our obstacles depends upon these two. So the progress in terms of the path itself requires us to have this, these two. So he says, to be clear, he says, again, quoting another Mahayana Sutra, he says that faith in the Mahayana, the Bodhisattvas, and indeed everything resulting from the Mahayana, comes from accurately reflecting on the truths and meanings with an undistracted mind. So there's truths and meanings, and Rinpoche says, so he says actually the undistracted mind is this mental one-pointedness, the serenity aspect, while this accurate reflection on truths and meanings refers to the insight aspect. Therefore, he says, we've got to achieve both of these qualities through sustained analysis with our discerning wisdom. We need to be able to think clearly and see very, very clearly. And then secondly, we need to be able to do that in light of and with the power of a one-pointed focus. And he says, and you can't achieve these, and this is one of the aspects of this, with just analytical meditation or just with focused mind. So, and then he quotes another. He says, once people have cultivated insight and serenity, then they are free from the bondage of dysfunctional tendencies and from the bondage of signs. So he says, this dysfunctional tendencies here refers to these latent propensities on our mind stream, which produce these increasing degrees of misconception. So this text is going to be a bit difficult here, but what he's saying is essentially we have a tendency, we have these latent tendencies towards self-grasping, for instance. So normally within a traditional Buddhist sense, this is considered to be in light of our karmic latencies, but also we could argue that even from a non-Buddhist point, there are these tendencies to grasp that may be genetically or sort of evolutionary sort of aspects of our understanding, which is we have a tendency to think me, my. And the problem about this is that while it can be useful at a low level, at a simple level, as we mature and understand it, it becomes an obstacle for us, and it becomes a cause of suffering for us. So this nature of this latent propensity of grasping, self-grasping, is what we need to eliminate. And the signs, the bondage to the signs, is this ongoing attachment to these things, so not being able to let go of them. And then Ratna Kalashanti says essentially that the insight eliminates the latent propensities, and it's the serenity that eliminates the grasping onto that. So he says these are the benefits attributed to serenity and insight. But there are lots of, he says, and there are lots of other statements like that. So one of the aspects of this primarily is to say, essentially, that we need to have the axe to cut the root, right? But in order to make sure that we don't sort of fall back on that or forget to carry on cutting that root, to keep on sustaining our vigilance, then we need to have that the strength of our focus. There's also, I think, a degree of clarity in this. So some of these issues here are quite complex, and I may make mistakes, and I think this is why I said it before, but again and again, it's important for you to think carefully and say, well, maybe Ben's right, but I read something else there. And I'm not going to dispute that, okay? So don't just accept what I say on this. So then he says, well, how do we say that serenity and insight include all the states of meditative concentration? And Je Rinpoche uses this idea of a tree. He says, again, a tree. So we have the branches, the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits of a tree are limitless in terms of all the trees that there are many different limitless numbers of these things. But the core at which they all arrive at is the root. So this is saying this is sort of really the basis at the root, and in the sense is the trunk where the roots where the trunk meets the ground. This is a normal tree, not a sort of special tree. So he says that in this sense, in this example, or if this metaphor, serenity and insight are the core, this root, where all the different states of concentration are fruition. So he says, in that sense, it's because without the serenity, we don't have the ability to achieve all these many different types of concentration. So one of the aspects of this is that Buddha himself trained under Udaka, another teacher, before he became enlightened, after he left home. And he learned how to train in meditation in serenity. So these teachers, they taught him serenity, and he learned how powerful serenity was in terms of bringing utility to the mind. So a lot of Buddhism is based upon his own personal experiences there, which gave him this incredible strength of mind, this flexibility of mind, and the ability to use the mind accordingly. Now, of course, in the West, there tends to be more focus on, in terms of training. When we're looking at training, we're all much more aware of physical training. Lots of people doing gym work or yoga work and so on. And the mind is sort of not really talked about very much. And yet, especially within the Buddhist tradition, the body is slightly more neglected in terms of training. There's not many training courses for, like, sort of doing assault courses or stuff in the Buddhist tradition, but there's a lot of mental training, and this mental training primarily is to do with developing this flexibility and this suppleness and this clarity of mind, so this quality of mind, which then enables us to really make a huge difference in terms of our realizations and in terms of our ability to recognize and understand things clearly. So this recognition, being able to recognize something, depends upon discerning wisdom. The ability to pull it apart, break it apart, recognize all the different parts of it is discerning wisdom. And within that, then we're able to sustain and hold what we see very, very clearly, as if it's right in front of us, whatever it is, and be able to examine it very, very clearly without any distraction whatsoever. And when we do so, we can then see even the most complex or reasonably complex objects. We're able to sustain them there and see them very, very brightly. So there's a story, I think, again, a Zen story, which is when a monk was who'd had many years of experience of meditation, was sitting watching a willow in the garden one evening, and people who looked saw he looked like a willow. His absorption was so complete that the object and the subject became intertwined. His identity, his ability to see so clearly was reflected in his own appearance. So this doesn't, I mean, I'm not saying that it was a sort of hallucination, just that he became sort of willow-like, right? So in that sort of sense, what we see is this idea of a very, very powerful mind, a very, very powerful focus, has this ability to sort of transform and to really get to grips with understanding. When we have that, then it has a dramatically greater transformative effect on us in terms of our mind. Now, I think I'm jumping around a bit, so maybe I should shut up. So again, Kamalashila, he's a Indian yogi from the 700s or the 800s AD. So he said, you know, although Buddha talked many times about different types of concentration, bodhisattva concentrations, in the end, serenity and insight cover them all. Therefore, why not just as practitioners? Then these are the two we need to work on. So the nature of serenity and insight, this is stated in the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning. It says, when you dwell in solitude and you direct your attention properly with inwards, you attend to just those topics upon which you have carefully reflected. You're not distracted, right? Your attention is mentally engaged by continuously attending inwards. The state of mind wherein you do this, and the way in which you stay there, and this incredible physical and mental pliancy or flexibility arises. This is known as serenity. So this generally means that we can take any object of meditation that's appropriate in the sense this is one that's going to generate a positive mental effect on us, such as the 5 aggregates or any of the topics within the sutras, or such as karma or love, loving kindness, any of these. And then with this mind, we then sustaining our mindfulness and vigilance, we focus our attention on this object and fix to it continuously. And then our mind stabilizes of its own accord, and we're able then to remain focused on that object of meditation. So when we do this, once we've developed practice with this, then this a natural physical bliss, physical and mental sort of bliss, not overwhelming bliss, but one which is sort of a real sense of joy, of fulfillment, really arises. This is actually a sort of not just a mental, it's a physical, and not just an emotional state. It's very much a physical state. Is again, everybody mentions this, not just the Buddhists who do meditation. And then along with this is this very, very strong fluidity and this flexibility, this ability just to be able to not be fixated, yeah, or distracted at all. And at that point, then our meditative concentration is known as serenity. So typically, being able to sustain this, he says, he does mention it here, but it will later on, being able to sustain our attention inwardly without it becomes effortless. After practice, we don't even need to work on it. It arises naturally, and then at that point, we should be able to sustain our concentration effortlessly for about 4 hours. Yeah, without break, without any wavering, without any interruptions or any sort of distraction at all. So that ability just to be able to sustain it like that for about 4 hours. So this is sort of the nature of serenity. And then insight, the sutra says, the same sutra says, once we have that, we're able to eliminate this. This state actually helps to eliminate various gross forms of the afflictions. So certain types of gross affliction are no longer are easy for us to develop. We can still have them. We can still be we lose our mindfulness, like we might end up in an argument or whatever, or we can see something in our students or in our friends which really disturbs us, and we can get upset and we can lose it. And at that point, we can then our minds can be almost completely forgotten, and we can lose it and develop malice or any normal of these afflictions. But it takes a lack of this mindfulness. So generally, once we've achieved this pliancy, this serenity, this doesn't occur. It only takes, we have to sort of really let go a bit for that to happen. So this is one of the aspects of this, is to be aware of that once we've developed this, we still need to sustain some degree of mindfulness. But once we've attained this, because we have this pliancy and because we've got this ability to sustain and govern or direct our mind, then the idea of allowing it to wander off into an afflictive state is very unlikely. Personally, I think there's potential for pride to arise, and this is one of the aspects of where we need to be careful also to not become proud. And one of the aspects of that within the Buddhist tradition is to remember selflessness, and then this helps us to diminish our pride. Likewise, to consider where we are next to Buddhas, and we think, okay, actually, I've still got a long way to go. So in this way, we can sort of begin to help moderate our pride. But these sort of things can still arise. So when we then discern, we take the image of the object that we're in meditation, and we look at it, and we differentiate any meanings of it. In other words, we work out how it works, or how it's composed, or what its consequences are, or its or what the ramifications of the object are, and likewise we examine it and we analyze it, and so on. Then this is called insight, right? So it is through essentially thinking about, examining, breaking down, assaying, if you like, sort of breaking it apart, putting it back together again, breaking it apart, putting it back together, understanding it, understanding its process, understanding how what ramifications it has on our minds, on our mind, in terms of the way we see things, how it affects us, how it affects others. So, for an example, if we think, especially with this very, very powerful mind developed from serenity, if we think about death awareness, as we understand the fact of death, we begin to see some of the ramifications of concentrating on death, how it affects us, how just recognizing death affects our sense of self, or in terms of how much time we have. It affects our sense of ownership, or our sense of like property, and how, in a sense, we have to let go of these things. So we begin to see more and more clearly how these things work and how they affect us. And this is incredibly powerful when we're taking the Dharma into account and we're working on using it to continue our path, to develop our path. Likewise, with love, loving kindness, compassion, once we've developed this serenity, then the power of recognizing and generating loving kindness for all beings is dramatic, very, very dramatic indeed, and makes a huge, substantial difference in terms of our response. So he says this, one of these aspects of this is essentially that thorough examination in terms of this insight, and especially early on in insight, when we're working on the analytical phase of insight, where we're breaking it down, looking at it, recomposing it, breaking down, looking at it, recomposing it, sustaining our concentration. Some people feel that this is not meditation, and that meditation does not involve discursive engagement with the object. So one of the aspects of this is, of course, when we're doing this, we're thinking about the ramifications, the consequences, how it works, how it fits in, and what effect it has, and so on. When we do that, this involves not necessarily thinking like, oh, I wonder why, la, 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 but in terms of it involves manipulating the object of meditation. And because we're looking at it in the context in which it's found. And in that sense, what we find is that this is known as discursive or analytical meditation. And when we do that, some people say that involves signs. And because it involves signs, it's conceptual. And because it's conceptual, it's not true meditation. So there's an idea that essentially we should be working on non-conceptual meditation, and Rinpoche again and again says, no, we do need to use conceptual meditation. It's absolutely thoroughly necessary as a part of our development of insight. We can have and we can develop incredible states of serenity, really amazing states of serenity. We can even develop superpowers with just serenity alone. That doesn't free us from samsara. It doesn't engage us in the bodhisattva path. So it's easy for us to say, okay, well, somebody might have these superpowers and they've got, these abilities, and they're incredibly calm and they're sort of free of these coarse afflictions. So they look very holy, and yet they have no insight whatsoever in terms of these understanding things. So that we have to be careful not to eliminate the need for analytical thought. Now, I believe even those Mahayana traditions which tend to sort of say, oh, like Zen, right? Zen means meditation, comes from the word chan, I think is another word for samatha. So in that sense, it's sort of the idea of like we just sit there and literally just sit there and do nothing. And yet actually there's still mindfulness, there's still vigilance, there's still the koan. So in these aspects, in fact, the koan itself is working unconsciously in terms of analysis. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think it's probably a very, very powerful mechanism. But the way in which it differs in terms of the Tibetan tradition from Lama Tsong-kha-pa is essentially there's a tendency within the Chinese Mahayana, albeit followers of Nagarjuna, to talk about the ineffability of understanding, of being able to reason emptiness or selflessness, whereas the Nalanda tradition, as found in the Himalayas, tends to say you can use reason, especially within the late Madhyamaka of Chandrakirti. You can use reason to point directly at and to see correctly selflessness or emptiness. So these sort of things are very, very slightly different. Mainly, I think, is a methodological difference rather than one's wrong and one's right. We'll deal with that much later on when we deal with the Insight chapter. Yeah, Rinpoche has some things to say about this too. So in brief, serenity is the one-pointed attention, and insight is proper discernment, right? So these two work together. And again, he says, Maitreya says in the ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, he says, know that as the path of serenity is is abbreviating the name of a phenomenon, which is a bit of a long thing of saying primarily sustaining awareness on a single object, whereas understand the path of insight to be analysis of its meanings, in other words, breaking it down and understanding it. And then again, the same sutra says, based on a genuine stability through directing our attention to the mind and through differentiating phenomena, there is meditative serenity and insight. So Rinpoche then says this states, and he's going to repeat this, stabilization of our mind on the basis of genuine concentration is serenity, and the wisdom that differentiates phenomena is insight. And he says these comments, we can find many, many sutras. So he's doing this. He's got Maitreya, he has a Sangha, he uses Kamala Shila. He says there are lots of these people who again and again say exactly the same thing. For us to therefore dismiss it and say, oh, this is just Tibet or this is just Tsong-kha-pa is a mistake. And so there's a very, very clear, long-standing tradition within the Mahayana tradition here of this distinction here. You know, Mahasanga is a 3rd century, very, very early Mahayana, and slightly different in terms of some of the insights to Nagarjuna, but still very, very early Mahayana, very, very strong influence in China. So not to be dismissed. So, and again, so he's now, I think he's carrying on, stages of meditation as a Sangha. After you have quelled the distraction of external objects, you rest in a delighted and pliant mind, which naturally and continuously engages an internal object of meditation. This is called serenity. I think that's one of the best definitions that I've read so far. And when we remain in serenity, the analysis of that object is called insight. So the serenity's object, and this is Ratna Kalasanti, says the serenity's object of insight, when we have that, is non-discursive, right? So insight's object of meditation is discursive. So then, Rinpoche says, therefore, we can sort of see that serenity and insight are not differentiated in terms of their respective objects of meditation. We can use the same objects of meditation for both. And he says, you know, we can actually have meditative serenity that rests on emptiness, and we can have insight that does not know emptiness. And likewise, we can switch those around. So he says, you know, meditative serenity, shine, is the Tibetan word, is this quietening, is this subtle, is this gentling of our minds, this sort of settling of our minds into a very quiet, calm, and flexible state. Whereas insight, laktong, is a superior, or if you like, special sight, insight. So some people, he says, this is again looking at what some people have said. Now, one of the aspects of this is not because he's picking up, you know, he's wrong and he's wrong and he's right and he's right. What he's doing is he's saying we might in our own minds, we might think such and such. So he uses this way of using ideas that other people have had to say it's very easy for us to adopt these ideas. The people who wrote these things or say these things are very bright. They're experienced practitioners. So he himself, I believe, has said, well, maybe it means this. And then it's like, no, it doesn't, because such and such. So we shouldn't see this as being polemical. It's not trying to establish disputes with different schools or different people. We know already that the Lamrim is very, very inclusive in terms of the way in which it's written. But what he's doing is using these different arguments to be able to unpick and to clarify. So we want to just make that clear. When he says some claim, he's not trying to say, you know, and they're wrong. He's saying we can make, it's very easy for us to make these claims too. So he said that, that we might have this idea that a mind resting in a non-discursive state without a vivid intensity is serenity, and while a mind with a vivid intensity is insight. So he says this way, in a sense, it's like saying when we are able to rest, but there's not a clarity, there's no vivid and no sort of clearness to it, then that's serenity because it's calm. And when there's clarity, then that's the insight there. And he says not only the issue primarily is that not only does this sort of slightly contradict or pretty much contradict what we've just talked about from these various different sources, including Kamalashila, Asanga, Maitreya, and the sutras, where we can see that essentially serenity is attention concentrated single-pointedly, insight is properly distinguishing the meaning of something. He says, anyway, going to the specifics of this particular idea, the presence of absence of vivid intensity in a non-conceptual consciousness is whether or not there is laxity. So one of the aspects of this is when we're developing our concentration levels, when we're working on this, if there's a tendency towards dullness, like if we're using a visualized object and it tends to be dull or lose its form or not remain clear or bright, if we're using something like, for instance, compassion, if the sense of compassion or the relationship with that compassion in terms of the object of meditation isn't clear, isn't bright, isn't easily available to us, this is a sign of laxity, this tendency to over-relax. Yeah? So if we over-relax, then things tend to become dull. And in fact, it's very easy for us to drift off towards sleep. So this is one of the aspects of looking when we're meditating or developing this serenity, is when things begin to go dull, is that this is a sign of sleepiness or when we're allowing ourselves to be too relaxed. So we're trying at first to relax our mind, right? Really trying to relax our mind because it's agitated. And then as we relax it, if we can relax, and then there comes a point where we actually start falling asleep. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, that's over relaxed. So we need to bring it back up again a bit. Yeah. So we need to be a bit alert, or keep a strong awareness, clear awareness, not too excited, and not too relaxed. So he says this lack of clarity has got nothing to do with serenity. This is a laxity. And he said, once you remove the laxity, then we have this incredible clarity, this very, very strong clarity, bright clarity is a sign of serenity. So if it begins to shake, if it becomes easily distracted, then this is too much excitement. So we need to get a little bit more relaxed. So one of the aspects of this is learning how to tune ourselves to keep our energy levels stable. Yeah. So this is all about developing that stability, our attentive stability, not to be too intense, not to be too loose, too relaxed, right? So Zen went about wisdom that focuses on the real nature. He says this in accordance with when we recognize in it as its object either of the two selflessnesses. The two selflessnesses, selfless of the person, selflessness of phenomena, but also another way of looking at that is talking about selfless and emptiness. So he says this is how we can identify wisdom, not to do with how clear our insight is, our meditation is. The clarity is to do only with serenity. So we can't depend upon clarity to be an indicator of insight. What we can recognize as insight is whether or not we are able to see or recognize the selfless nature of the object of meditation. And he says, if we begin to identify our insight into that when we're in a non-discursive, clear and blissful state, then we're making a huge error, because there are countless states of consciousness, of concentration rather, which are blissful, clear and non-discursive. And yet they have no orientation towards the reality of objects, which is the lack of self. Yeah. So when we're talking about this insight, in the end, Rinpoche is saying, let's be clear that when we're talking about the reality of objects, what we're talking about here is this selflessness, right? So the word self here, we'll go into this again later on, but when we're talking about self, we're not meaning just like a person or me. We're really talking about an essence that means that it stands alone on its own. So it's this idea that something has something about it which makes it what it is, right? So this essence belongs to the object itself, or including ourselves. So normally when we talk about ourselves, the me is this idea of them being something that stands alone, that exists in the world, that interacts, for which property and sensations and so on are worthwhile accumulating. Yeah. So there's a cherishing of this sense of this self, which grasps at making itself more comfortable. Yeah, that's what isn't there. This is the selflessness. So when we understand that, and we'll go into understanding how to get there later on, then it's like, okay, well, now I understand. Then the afflictions that are self-centered, this self-centeredness that is baked into our lives in every single moment of our lives, otherwise, begins to loosen. When we develop serenity, it begins to be shattered. Literally, we're able to take our insight and shatter this idea. It's not painful. It can be a bit painful, but the main thing is afterwards is this sense of complete liberation and empowerment, complete liberation and empowerment. And it is actually a real liberation. It's a freedom. So this is, insight. This is the path of insight. So he says there's this point, first of all, where we need to be able to do this pulling apart and taking together. We need to be able to use these methods, not because it's a game. This is because it helps us to establish and to remove any latent predispositions that we have regarding its nature. Yeah. So it says, even if we have no idea about selflessness whatsoever, I think this is what I was mentioning earlier on, it said a totally non-discursive mind can be adequate to induce this bliss and clarity. So this non-discursive mind means this ability to stabilize our mind, then from which arises this natural bliss and this natural fluidity, this sort of flexibility. It says if we keep our mind this way for a long time, then we are able to develop this incredibly serviceable energy, so the ability for us to engage in all sorts of amazing feats. So it says this bliss also is accompanied with this mental clarity, right? So but this alone is not a concentration that knows reality. So we know this is the case, even if we don't particularly trust the sources. But if we trust the life of Buddha, we recognize that Uddaka and his prior teachers were not enlightened, where Buddha was. So Buddha was not just copying what his former teachers gave him. He went beyond them. That's what made him a Buddha. And what made the distinction was not the level of concentration which they had and they trained him, but his insight. So primarily this understanding of insight, which is the underlying key to enlightenment. So this is why we have to distinguish clearly that insight, serenity, is a beautiful state of mind, but it is not enough to liberate us. So then he segues into why we need to cultivate both. So he says it's a bit like if we light an oil lamp. So this is not a torch, this is an oil lamp with a flame or a candle, if we like, in order to see a picture in the middle of the night. It's very easy to see it, the picture, if the light is bright and also there's no wind. So as long as there's no wind, it's very, very easy for us to see that picture. But if the lamp is not bright, or it is bright but it's flickering in the wind, then we will not see the image at all clearly because it's just flickering all the time. So when it's not bright, this primarily is a metaphor for this laxity. And when it's moving, this is a metaphor for excitement. So what we need to do is to eliminate this excitement, this laxity, and then we're able to hold and develop that flame until it becomes brighter and brighter through practice. This is through practicing serenity. And then we're able to see the image very, very clearly. Whatever we want to see, we can see it clearly. And he says, likewise, when we're looking for the profound meaning, so he's now going to explain the analogy, we will see clearly reality if we have both the wisdom that discerns the meaning of reality and an unmoving attention that stays as we wish on the object of meditation. How if we do not have the wisdom that doesn't know things are, then it's like having our eyes closed. Yeah, we can't see it. We can't see it. So even if we've managed to completely develop a calm mind, a calm, bright candle of mind that can see clearly things in the dark, if our eyes are closed, we can't. It doesn't do anything for us. He says also, if our eyes are open, we sort of have some awareness and we're looking, but our concentration, our flame is flickering and dim and all over the place. What we can see is not very clear, right? So we can see something, we might see some outlines, and those outlines will have an effect. They will still have an effect on us. They're still meaningful, but to really understand directly, to see it clearly, that's not available to us. And this is why we need both serenity and we need insight. And then the Moon Lamp Sutra, Chandrapradipa Sutra, says, the power of meditative serenity makes our mind steady. It's insight that makes it into a mountain. So developing the steadiness is what we need in terms of developing the ability to build that mountain. Once we have that steadiness, our mind becomes as strong and as mighty as a mountain. And in terms of what this means, it's like our strength eliminates these bad views of the view of the self and all the affiliated afflictions that arise from that, completely eliminated. It cannot be shaken. So what's meant by the mountain is that it's unshakable, it's unbreakable, it's not going to change. So he says it's possible for us to use our discerning wisdom, to use our intelligence to analyze the meaning of selflessness. But because our mind is unsteady, like a lamp in the wind, our concept of selflessness will be dramatic, and it can still be transformative, but it's not going to be, it's still going to be unclear, and it's going to be shaky because our mind itself is not stable. And likewise, our mindfulness and vigilance. Until we've developed this very, very powerful serenity, we can't rely upon our mindfulness and vigilance being present all the time. So when we're developing our mindfulness in terms of our ethical discipline, this is already beginning to set the standard for our mindfulness in meditation. This is why actually one of the aspects of ethical practice and restraint and consideration and being aware of what we're saying, what we're doing, what we're thinking all the time helps us to develop our serenity. They're not separate. We can't imagine that if we're going to have strong thoughts or negative emotions, that we're going to be able to sit peacefully and meditate in 10 minutes or 20 minutes time, because our mind's going to be like this. So likewise, we need to be able to sustain these our tools, these great tools for change. Tools for change in our body, in our mind, is this vigilance, mindfulness. These pair together. I think we talked about that really at the beginning of last year. So then this point, it says in the compendium of the Teaching Sutra, is that once we have this meditative equipoise, another word for serenity, then we are able to understand reality just as it is. And when we're able to understand reality just as it is, then we are able to be liberated. So he says, serenity allows the stopping of two primary faults. One of them is this movement, unwanted movement, in terms of a bit like if you imagine you're trying to see something clearly, but it's moving too fast all the time. And then the other one is to do with a complete distraction or hopping, like something like looking at. If we watch our minds even slightly, we see that it sort of has a tendency to be like a fly, sort of jumps all over the place like this, and we think, okay, we calm it down, and then it's like over there, or then it starts thinking about the thinking, right? So all of these things is like we need to work on just calm down, and it's like fall asleep. So it's like no, wake up a bit, okay, all right. And it's like, so all the time at first we're like continually having to apply. Yeah, this is the first stage of meditation, is we're always applying, apply, continually working at keeping our mind on the treadmill, right? Keeping it going, not too fast, not too slow, not too sleepy, not too excited, right? All the time, on the attention, bring it back. So it's like it'd be a bit exhausting at first. First of all, like, oh, this is easy. Oh, meditation, oh, it's lovely, right? We do it for a week, and sort of a month later, it's like, oh, gosh, can I bear to sit on the cushion, right? So that's the things that we're beginning to actually do some work. It's quite hard work at first. Then very gradually, if we keep up doing it daily, then I'm beginning to see, okay, I get more familiar with it. I learn how to deal with these things and keep back on the treadmill. No. So there comes a point then when we actually need to slightly back off from the training because we're overcompensating. So you just let off a little bit. So like that. Yeah. But also it's like, we have these things like when we're doing, especially when doing serenity, right? Serenity meditation, just trying to develop calm mind. And it's like, we can sit for 20 minutes thinking, I got a cup of tea. So, what's that? So it's like, okay, no. And sometimes even a little bit is like still way back there. I've got to remember to post the parcel. So it sits at the back there. Little, right? I've got to remember. It's like, it's nothing's there. You've got to keep just on the one thing. This is why essentially it's so important when we're doing a meditation practice to say this this time, these moments, these 20 minutes are for meditation, not for keeping a list of all the things I've yet to do, not thinking about what I'm going to do or anything like that. Just that's finished now. So when I'm meditating, I'm sitting doing my meditation practice. I'm training, right? Mind training. It's like, okay, I have to train. It's like being at the gym. I can't just sort of run off the gym and do some shopping or whatever, or go and relax and have a cup of tea and come back to it. Right? The point is to say, no, this time is all I've got. I've got 20 minutes or whatever it happens to be every day. Train. And that's how to do it. So we need to keep this joyous effort. So it says it's absolutely relevant to us to know that if we allow ourselves to be distracted, then it just weakens our practice altogether. And in fact, Shantideva says, the person whose mind is distracted lives between the fangs of the afflictions. So this aspect is very true. Essentially, while we allow ourselves to become distracted, then it's very easy for us to find our minds going into malicious or critical or self-punishing or other punishing or desire or just random rubbish, right? So this is like this not good. So learning not to be distracted is very important for us. It says once we can fix our develop serenity, once we fix our attention on an object of meditation, we can keep it there, right? And it's like, and once we develop that, once we release that object and we move on to others, then we are able to sustain our concentration, our focus on whatever it is that we're moving on to, and we're able to do it with that mindfulness, with that vigilance naturally, which is why there is this sort of sense of why the scriptures say once you develop serenity, there's a loss of affliction, because we have some control over our minds. We've developed mind training. We've been working on our mind. We've got a six-pack of mind, right? We're really good, really powerful and strong. So that ability comes from doing the work. It doesn't come from sort of thinking about doing the work or wanting to do the work or say, well, one day I'll do it. It comes from saying, okay, let's take some time out today, every day, and I'm going to do my mind work, right? I mean, why is it we all go jogging or whatever, or go to the gym and so on? And it's like, and so on, right? My body is my temple. Well, what about the mind that's living in the temple? Yeah. What about that? It's sort of like, a priest sleeping in the corner of the rather nice temple. It's like, and then I don't want to, all over the place. It's like, who wants to visit the temple, right? Oh, very pretty, but watch out for the priest. So we have to be like, think, okay, let's try and work on developing the mind as well. He says also, actually, there's this aspect too. He says that if we don't recognize, if we only work on sitting, on developing our meditation, then our ability to cultivate it will be weak. We need to have these supporting aspects of the six perfections, or if we're following another path, the similar aspects of ethical discipline. We use the motivating power of our compassion. We use the motivating power of our insight to develop these aspects of generosity, patience, ethical discipline, and joyous effort, in order as goads, in order to keep us as sticks, if you like, or if you want also, carrots, to help us in terms of keeping our motive going, to keep us on our path. Otherwise, it's easy for us to think, it's just too much work, too tiring. So again, also the point about it is that if we have those, and if we're engaging in our meditation with these motivations, with the motivation of a bodhicitta, then it's Mahayana meditation. And likewise, it has all the benefits of Mahayana meditation in terms of the fact that with that motive, this as infinite motive of recognizing and taking responsibility for the suffering of infinite, endless number of beings, then it's like it doesn't matter how comfortable we are, we will still recognize the suffering of others, and therefore we will still keep at it. We'll still work at our path, regardless of how much comfort we have in our lives. So then Rinpoche talks a little bit about why is it that we talk about concentration and then wisdom, what the order in which these things are in. So he says, he quotes Shantideva, and he says, insight, when insight is possessed with serenity, it literally destroys our afflictions. And knowing this, then we should seek serenity at the outset. So then there's some people who say, well, why is it that we talk about saying we should first seek serenity and then insight? Because in one sense, they're indeterminate. We need to be able to develop, in terms of enlightenment, we need to develop our insight in order, and then we need to be able to apply it using meditation, using serenity. And Je Rinpoche has something to say about this, and I find it very compelling. He says, but also, he doesn't say no to that. It's not like he says, no, that's wrong. He says, look, it's clear. We don't need to have serenity in order to develop an understanding of the view that knows selflessness. Also, or compassion, or death awareness, or any of these. Because we can see in ourselves that we don't have serenity, and yet we can develop these views, one or more of these views, right? We don't even need to have serenity already in order to experience mental transformation in light of these understandings, right? So we can see when we recognize karma, we recognize death awareness, we can see a transformation in our lives, and that didn't depend upon serenity. He says, nothing precludes mental transformation being brought on by repeated analysis and consideration, right? He said, if we were to make the mistake, in the sense of saying that serenity was necessary for mental transformation, then we'd have to say that any experience that we have, including a traumatic experience, couldn't affect our mind unless we had already achieved serenity, and that just doesn't make any sense. In other words, he recognizes that experience itself, our development of experiential understanding, is the root of mental transformation, not serenity. So it says, so why do we need it? And if we already have mental transformation without serenity, then why do we need to have serenity? And he says, primarily because until we have this pliancy, until we've developed this incredible mental flexibility that serenity gives us, we're not able to, our insight into the nature of reality is approximate, not direct. It's not experiential. And this is primarily because, although he doesn't quite go into it in this way, but I think this is probably reasonably accurate. When we're working on emptiness and developing a non-discursive understanding of emptiness, first of all, it comes from an analytical position. We're working out the absence of something. There's something not here. Yeah. So this is what emptiness means. It means, yeah, it's like the idea of thinking that somebody says to me that there's an elephant in this room, and I sort of say, what, a picture? And he says, no elephant. And I'm like, I can't see an elephant. He says, it's very, very small. Yeah, there's a small elephant in the room. And I'm like, I can't see it still. And they say, okay, well, look, it's here. And so we go to one end and we look very carefully, and there's no elephant there. And I say, well, look, there's no elephant. He says, no, it's run to the other end, right? So we're chasing this elephant. So we go and look in the other end, but there's no elephant there. So this idea is saying, at some point or another, I need to try to find a way of being able to demonstrate. Maybe there's no footprints, there's no droppings, there's no food, and there aren't such things as elephants, small, tiny elephants, to be able to convince my friend that there's no elephant in the room. Yeah. So initially, this requires reasoning. We need to reason and recognize the lack of something, because it's not the presence of something. It's not like we're identifying the cup in the room. We're actually talking about the lack of an elephant in the room, and that's the object of our meditation. Therefore, this involves a degree of a sort of inference. It involves recognizing the lack of something, which is sort of rational. And yet what we need to do is to have a direct experience of that, not an indirect experience of that. In order to develop a direct experience of the lack of an elephant, we need to have the clarity that is available to us from this heightened state of clear mind, clear attention that arises from serenity. When we have a clear ability to rest even at the absence and to be able to concentrate upon the absence of something without any discursiveness whatsoever, then there comes a point where the object and the subject of these cease to be recognized. Because one of the aspects of serenity is there's no object subject duality available at that time, right? Remember, in one sense, object-subject is really just two sides of the perception, right? Perception of something is the idea of where we see, when we perceive something, the object-subject aspect of that is just a way in which we think about how that perception arises. But the perception is neither sort of a subject or object, it's a perception itself, right? So in this way, what we're saying is when we can actually directly focus on the empty nature of the truth, the lack of the elephant in the room, then our minds and the emptiness cease to be separate. At that point, we have a direct perception of emptiness. And this is very transformative, very, very, very transformative indeed. So yes, selflessness itself, just understanding selflessness, helps us to transform, but it's this direct perception which is it is actually qualitatively completely at a different level. Completely at a different level. Once we have a direct perception, a direct experiential perception, there's no change, certainly in this life, there's no change to our mind. We can't go back to unseeing it, yeah, because it's so clear, it's so apparent. It's a bit like when we actually recognize that this is, maybe this isn't a cup of tea, but it's poison, then we will no longer drink it. Because we know it for what it is, right? At that point, we know it for what it is. In fact, this is just tea, so I can drink it. Because I know it for what it is. I know that it's not poison, then I'm okay. I'm absolutely safe with it. When we know it for what it is from this very, very clear, direct, experiential understanding, that's it. So he says, in the way in which he says this, he says, until we have attained this serenity, we won't have the pliancy. We don't have the pliancy. We won't have the ability to generate the pliancy in the moment of when we're using selflessness, the object of our meditation. So therefore, it is, although we can develop insight, we can develop the understanding of insight. In fact, there's a lot of advantage to be said for doing that in terms of helping us overcome our obstacles in our serenity meditation. In the end, we need to have the serenity in order to give it the impact that we require. And he says, if we just work on He says, I mean, in another sense, as a way of talking about, when we talk about serenity and we talk about insight, this is a general way of looking at it, where in fact we're talking about it in terms of training in it rather than in having achieved it. So when we're talking about training in it, training in serenity, we obviously need to be training in serenity in order to have an undistracted mind to be able to think about anything. Now, that aspect slightly conflicts with what he was saying earlier about how one cannot have, if one lacks serenity, one can still have a transformative mind. But essentially is what he's saying is that when we're working on training in serenity, our mind becomes more and more flexible and our ability to develop insight becomes greater. As our ability to understand insight becomes greater, this helps us in terms of our training for serenity. So there is also this sort of thing where they tend to work well together. So he says there are all other aspects too. Remember is that in general, the latter develop based on the former. So the point about the six perfections, which we talked about a few weeks ago, is that the six perfections generally work in a sort of step by step, but they also work together as a group. So we shouldn't really necessarily imagine that there's a strict causal relationship, but there is an approximate causal relationship to them in terms of the dependencies. But on the other hand, what we're looking for to develop in the end is insight. And this is one of the reasons why we want this powerful insight. And the insight that we want is one which is not separate from serenity. Or, I mean, I'm saying serenity because it's written here, but samatha or shinne or any other term that we want to use for this concentration is absolutely the same. It's just a word. He said, and anyway, later on, once we've actually achieved serenity and insight, then when we develop our further skills, after we have achieved direct perception of emptiness, then the order of these two is indeterminate. In other words, we're working on all six perfections accordingly in different ways. So it's here that he says, basically from a Sangha level of yogic deeds, he says, for instance, once we know the reality of the Four Noble Truths, from the truth of suffering to the truth of the path, we can get an accurate understanding of that without even having achieved the first meditative stabilization. So this means we're still training. But once this knowledge is clear to us, this gives us stimulus to stabilize our mind. So again, primarily, once we begin to understand the truth of the path, and I think really with the Four Noble Truths, there's the second and the fourth, which are the ones which involve a considerable amount of analysis. We need to understand the cause of suffering. We need to understand the path to the freedom from the path to eliminate that cause. So these two here are really the two most important ones for us to understand. When we get them, when we really understand them, then our training in samatha or in serenity is sort of obvious. We need to do it. We understand why we need to do that. So it's very hard for us to, and until we've really got some sort of understanding of the path, then it's pretty difficult to see why we need to train in serenity. There are lots of advantages anyway. This pliancy. Lots of people do yoga for physical pliancy. Yoga initially, hatha yoga, initially was also to develop mental pliancy, but the way in which it's generally taught in the West is only primarily with physical pliancy. And likewise, here, the Newland tradition talks about this pliancy, this flexibility of the mind, and then actually the body becomes naturally flexible. And I've seen this. I'm not very flexible at all, but I've seen people who have achieved serenity who have an incredible mental and physical flexibility. It's quite remarkable. So in brief, Rinpoche says here, just to remember, and I'm going to just recap very slightly, that that the training in Serenity is called Serenity, as the training in Insight is also called Insight, as well as the achievement of these things. And he says, he says, I might be using actual insight and actual serenity to talk about the actual achievement of it rather than the training in it, just for clarity's sake. And again, he says, if we want to know, to be clear, that the 9, in terms of the training, the 9 states, so they're basically 9 levels of serenity according to Kamala Shila, a meditative serenity. And the fourfold analysis, which is this discrimination and so on of understanding, is called insight. So we're going to be working on those, and that's enough for this week. And this is where we finish on a general overview of how serenity and insight work together and the order that they appear. And the next week is going to be on how to prepare for, develop how to train in serenity. Okay, and then after that we do how to train in insight, and then how to combine these together into the experience that leads to our enlightenment. And then then I think that's it for Lam Rim Chenmo. So then we'll know everything we need to know in order to become enlightened, and it's just up to us to do it, right? So when are we going to start? Okay, anyway, for the moment, let's call it today. And again, dedicating merit, and purpose of dedicating merit is to seal any benefits from this to our purpose, saying, okay, what I'm doing this because of my promise to all beings that I will help them, or will shoulder the burden of suffering for them, and I'll do this by becoming a Buddha. And therefore, anything that comes from this, I put solely to that purpose. So it's a reminder of my motivation. This is a good way for me to come back to this in the future, remember what I did, and that's its purpose. So that's what that is. And then let's finish off with a short meditation, maybe just for the time being, watching the breath, right?